For all his accomplishments and his many programs, whether you like them or not, Nixon's not remembered for any of those, really. He's remembered primarily for events that began on June 17, 1972, at the Watergate Hotel and Office Building in Washington, D.C. That night, 7 men are arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate building. They're led by this man, G. Gordon Liddy, who today is a conservative radio talk show host and celebrity. And when they're taken to the court, Bob Woodward, who's in this picture on the left, he's the guy on the right, he's the court reporter there, and he figures this is strange when a high-powered attorney shows up and helps to get these guys out of prison. And so Woodward will ultimately team up with Carl Bernstein, that's the other guy there, and these two guys, these two low-level Washington Post reporters, will begin to follow the money of who paid for the attorneys for the 7 guys who broke in and attempted to bug, actually, the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate. Eventually, they're able to link the lawyer's payment to Charles Colson, who's a White House attorney, and the slush fund that CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, was using to try to get Nixon to win the election. The media largely ignores the story and actually comes after Woodward and Bernstein for a long time. And it is not until a judge, Judge John Sirica, gets one of Nixon's advisors, McCord, and begins issuing subpoenas to gather data in 1973 that the rest of the mainstream media follows this. If you're interested in the story, it's a great movie called All the President's Men that follows this investigation. It's wonderful. The Irvin Committee is established to investigate what was going on exactly with these Watergate break-ins. And when they began calling people up to testify, they get a flood of confessions about all kinds of illegal activity that was happening around the attempts to get Richard Nixon reelected. Ultimately, John Dean, that's the guy on the right here, gives up Richard Nixon. He makes it clear that Nixon knew all about this and was, in fact, behind it. And a general climate of crime is revealed both in the White House and the Committee to Re-elect the President. But people say, and I don't know that I agree with this, but Nixon's efforts to cover this up and silence people was actually worse than what he really did. There was no proof that Nixon had planned the break-ins, but there was a whole lot of proof that he had coordinated attempts to try to cover up investigations into the break-in. Nixon is willing to throw anybody under the bus to try to protect himself, and continually insists on his innocence.
I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
By the way, the goal of Nixon's misdoings in this particular case were to make sure that George McGovern won the Democratic primaries. Nixon felt like he could easily beat McGovern and feared stronger candidates like Edwin Muskie. And so people might look at the 72 election and say, well, Nixon won it so easily, the cheating didn't matter. I don't know that he would have lost, but the cheating did matter because he won it so easily because he had the weak candidate that he wanted and not a stronger candidate to run against. Take a dramatic turn for the worse for Nixon when it's revealed through otherwise unspectacular testimony that there's a taping system in the White House that LBJ had installed, and every conversation that takes place is recorded. Nixon claims he has executive privilege, which is something he just makes up, by the way, and that there's top secret stuff on these tapes, and so he can't turn them over. As pressure mounts on Nixon and it begins to appear more and more that he's corrupt, he appoints a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, to investigate wrongdoing in the White House. He's investigating himself or appointing someone to investigate him. In October of 1973, Cox asked Nixon to turn over the tapes, and Nixon says no. What follows next is a night we call the Saturday Night Massacre. October 21st of 73, Nixon, furious that Cox has asked for the tapes, orders his Attorney General to fire Cox. His Attorney General refuses to do it, and so he appoints the next guy in the Justice Department to Attorney General and tells him to do it, who refuses to do it as well. Ultimately, Robert Bork, a White House lawyer, says he'll do it, and so Nixon makes him Attorney General, and he fires Cox. They replace him with a second special prosecutor named Jaworski, and Jaworski immediately asks for the tapes as well. And Nixon realizes There's really no way out. Nixon, as he becomes increasingly paranoid, will be shocked to find out, to learn, when a group of Republican congressmen come to the White House and they tell him to be prepared because there's going to be impeachment charges filed against him. They're going to start a trial to see if he needs to be removed from office. Nixon tells the Republicans to stand strong and they can win this thing. And they say, no, you don't understand, Mr. President. We're filing impeachment charges on you, not the Democrats. Nixon's a Republican, of course. And that's pretty much the end of Nixon. In late 1973, the Vice President Spiro Agnew had cut a deal and resigned from being Vice President to avoid being prosecuted and thrown in jail for taking bribes. Agnew was actually more corrupt than Nixon. And this gave Nixon a really unique opportunity. Nixon, understanding that he was not going to survive his own presidency, he too was going to have to resign, is in a position to appoint a new Vice President. And so he goes and he cuts a deal with a representative from Michigan named Gerald Ford. And the deal is pretty simple. Nixon will appoint Ford vice president, and then when Nixon is forced to resign shortly thereafter, Ford will give Nixon a full pardon so he doesn't have to serve any jail time. By the way, the whole idea of appointing a vice president was new too. Nixon simply does this to prevent the Democrats from gaining the White House and possibly prosecuting him, because with no vice president, it would have fallen to the Speaker of the House, who I believe was Mike McCormick, but was a Democrat nonetheless. And Ford is the first vice president to ever be replaced when that job comes open. In April of 1974, Nixon releases transcripts of the recordings of the White House tapes, but they've been doctored. Anything incriminating has been removed, and it's very obvious that they've been doctored, and suspicion mounts. The Supreme Court rules that Nixon has to turn over the tapes, and the House Judiciary Committee passes articles of impeachment. The tapes prove that Nixon is guilty, and Nixon actually disappears altogether for a period of a few days. Nobody knows where he is. When he returns on August 8th of 1974, he resigns. He comes out and says he's no longer going to be president. Now we have President Gerald Ford, who announces our long national nightmare is over. But I don't know if that's entirely true. Watergate will permanently scar Americans and severely undermine trust in our government, which quite honestly hadn't been doing too well all throughout the 60s. And to this day, Americans are still very prone to distrust governmental and major American institutions. And Watergate, probably more than any other single factor, is the reason why. Now we have President Gerald Ford, who announces our long national nightmare is over. But I don't know if that's entirely true. Watergate will permanently scar Americans and severely undermine trust in our government, which quite honestly hadn't been doing too well all throughout the 60s. And to this day, Americans are still very prone to distrust governmental and major American institutions. And Watergate, probably more than any other single factor, is the reason why.